to check out my website at michaelcross.net. Hello and welcome back. In this second hour, I'm going to veer away from the whole national American politics scene and go into something completely different. And that's going to be actually this whole issue of men who are, I guess you could say, going on strike against women and feeling like they don't want to have relationships. And before I go on, just want to encourage people to check out my website at michaelcross.net and also my YouTube channel. That's where I keep most of my shows after they've played. And that's at, well, again, Michael Cross. And if you type that into Google, you'll get the reference to freedom from conscience. And speaking of which, in my book series, I deal with this whole issue, but I deal with it in kind of an unconventional way, in which the heroine, she is in a relationship with someone who really does not want to have kids. And there's a really complex interplay there. And, of course, it being a psychological thriller, it can get kind of weird at times. But, well, you can check out a synopsis of the plot over at my website, michaelcross.net. But anyway, what I'd like to actually kind of go into is a couple aspects of this issue. The first is I just noticed that in China, they've learned how to edit cells. And part of the predictions associated with this, now of course it was mice, but hey, you know, how much more difficult is it to play around with human cells than it is mice cells? It just gets into ethics and that kind of thing. But the idea could be that in the future, a cell could be taken from a man or a woman, and it could be edited to turn it into a sperm cell, and therefore be able to get somebody pregnant. Now, the interesting thing about that is that someone could be, might be an infertile male who's able to impregnate his wife, or it could be a female. You could edit her cells and turn them into sperm cells, and she'd be able to get another female pregnant, or I guess in theory, herself pregnant without the help of anyone. Kind of an asexual reproduction with the assistance of a lab. And, you know, this brought up another thing in my mind. And that was when I was a kid, my parents had, they had quite a bit of property as opposed to it wasn't a huge amount of property. It wasn't like a big farm or something, but it was enough that they could just do some hobby farming. And they raised chickens. And the interesting thing was that when the chickens were, hatched out naturally, a hen sits on the eggs. That's how it's done in nature, not how it's done in factory farms. But anyway, the chickens were allowed to grow, and about half of them, of course, would be female. And of course, that's what we wanted. We wanted them for eggs. And the other half would be male. And the thing was, my parents would always choose, maybe one rooster per every dozen hens. And it would be like the healthiest and the strongest rooster. And the rest, well, they got their heads cut off and they got turned into, chicken dinners. And, someone sent me a video one time of a factory farm, and it showed how in factory farms, they sex the chickens. They check what their gender is when they are just hatched out from the incubators. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. The females, they go on one conveyor belt, and that's they're going to live their life in this crowded factory farm, laying eggs. And the other half, the males, since this is an egg production farm. The other half, the males, are just sent over to this meat grinder and they're ground up alive. I mean, the thing is that in the chicken world, most of the males are expendable. And in kind of a weird sense, so are they in human civilization. And I just want to bring that point out, that when you have, let's say you have, let's say World War II, a huge number of Russian men, and I was going to say young men, but there was just about any man who could carry a gun was fighting the Germans, and this decimated the male population. And after the war, Stalin really put a lot of money into daycare centers and stuff like that. And women, at first he thought about introducing polygamy throughout all of Russia. But then, of course, that would have been some really weird publicity for him, maybe. And he didn't want it, pictures out there of him looking like a Turkish sultan and so forth. So what they did instead was they encouraged women in villages to find men, preferably men who'd shown stability, men who were married, had children, families of their own. And they were to, for the good of the state, they were to get pregnant and to have babies. And the irony is the birth rate after the war in Russia was higher then than it is today in Russia. In fact, it's probably higher then than it is anywhere in Europe or even North America. And that just kind of shows that you could have a village where maybe there was only 4 or 5 men who could kind of do the job, and there might be, a couple hundred women. And yet, that was enough. I mean, you don't need that many men. I read somewhere where there's a guy in Morocco, I think he has some sultan or something, leader, and he had over 1,000 children. It's possible for guys to do that. And so, in an evolutionary sense, males have always been expendable. That's why women survive diseases better than men do. Women survive cold. Women tend not to get injured as much. And women are not sent into battle. Why? Because, hey, what good is it going to do you to win a war if half your female population's been wiped out? I mean, it's going to be that you're not going to, the next time there's a war, your population's not going to be high enough in order to fight back, and you'll be defeated then. So traditionally, it has been men, 99.9% of the time, who've done any kind of combat. And it was recognized that, you could lose a huge number of men, but still you had women. Now, this brings me to this whole thing that's called now, it's kind of an interesting social phenomena. It's called men going their own way. And I can understand some of their concerns. Now, this is related to, in Japan, there's a movement that's similar, and they call them herbivore men. But essentially, it's men that have kind of given up on long-term, committed relationships. And it seems like it could take two different sides. It can be, they may want a relationship that is dead end, they'll get together with a woman, make it clear, hey, I ain't going to have no kids, and I'm not going to have any wedding ring. And a lot of women accept that. A lot of them thinking they can change the guy. And, fat chance of that, in most cases. And, a lot of these guys feel like the marriage laws in the United States are negative to men. They have seen maybe their fathers, or maybe even themselves, be totally screwed when it comes to family courts. And they decide that it's not worth it. Now, the thing is, I just have to say this. While I do understand a lot of their viewpoints, and yes, I'll say this, there's a lot of princesses out there who've been spoiled, and they expect that when they're 25, that they should meet a guy who's 25, and he should be able to keep, a lifestyle, or at least be able to have a lifestyle that he's living, that regardless of whether she's at the same level or not, he should be at the same level that her father might be when he's 55 or 60. Been working a few years. Maybe she doesn't remember when she was just born and her parents were living in a little apartment someplace before they were able to afford to get a house. So yes, there are princesses like that. There are women who, they want everything and so forth. But there's always been those kinds of women. And today's materialistic society seems to glorify this narcissistic wannabe culture, both for women and men, I will note, okay? But these men who are giving up on women tend to really take a look at this particular aspect of, female society or gender and magnify that to where, all the women want is this, this, and this. And not realizing that most women are not in it just for what they can get out of a guy, any more than a guy would want to be with a woman for just what he can get out of a woman. I mean, there are other things associated with a mature relationship. There is friendship, companionship, commitment, the desire to have children. All of these things come together. And I think that probably the vast majority of women and the vast majority of men actually want something like that. But yet people get jaded, women and men both, wind up getting used in relationships, and they start kind of going tribal. Men kind of like, yeah, it's us versus them. Women, oh yeah, it's us versus them. Not a good thing for a society. Japan already, maybe Japan's just a little bit ahead of the Western world. Their birth rate has collapsed. And our birth rate, if it was not for immigration, everyone's like, immigration, this and this and this. But if it wasn't for immigration, the population of the United States would be collapsing, as would Germany, as would pretty much all of Europe. Okay? And, this is, I don't think it's really a good thing for a society when such a thing happens. Now, the thing is, Darwin, Charlie Darwin, the guy that came up with the evolution thing, well, he didn't come up with it, but he at least is credited with it. I mean, it's been around for a long time in one respect or another. Darwin said that intelligence and physical fitness was not necessarily the traits that were ultimately superior, but adaptation. Adaptation, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, is going to be the trait. Again, with Darwinism, it's who can make babies and project their posterity into the future. And so if you could be the smartest and most physically fit person on earth, and yet, if you're not having children, but yet let's say you have a servant and your servant has 4 kids, then in a biological sense, your servant is more adapted to society than you are, and therefore they have projected themselves out biologically into the next generation. So, 100 years later, maybe there's a plaque somewhere with your name on it someplace. Who knows? 100 years later, there may be a few dozen people who can trace their lineage back to your servant and say this was their ancestor. And in Darwinian sense, that is the trait, that is ultimately how you measure whether someone's been successful or not. Now, the thing is, if we have a situation where more and more and more men decide to take themselves out of the market, this actually creates more tribalism. Now, I've read some guys say, well, you know what, if we go on strike, this is going to force women to have to change. Oh, really? No. You know what it's going to do? It's just going to make competition for the guys that are still out there even more fierce. And many of those guys are going to learn that it's easy to become a user. I have talked to people who live in San Francisco. Now, the thing is, there is a much higher percentage of females than males in San Francisco, at least heterosexual. And I heard that because of that, a lot of women really compete there for males. I mean, a male doesn't have as hard a time getting dates and stuff like that there. Same was true for this one city I used to visit a few times in Ivanovo, Russia. It was a textile area, and despite the whole communist, we're all equal and this kind of stuff, usually people that worked in textile and so forth, making dresses, that sort of thing, were women. And Ivanovo had like this ratio of like 4-to-1 female to male. And, it was known, it's not that way anymore, but it was known in those days as being a place where a guy, if he couldn't get a date, there was something wrong. And so you kind of see this where if there's a few guys out there that are wanting to connect with women, and there's a lot of women, then the whole supply-demand thing is going to be in favor of the guy. And like I said, a lot of guys are just going to use this to their advantage. Now, I will say this, though. Biology ultimately will rear its head. Since we were talking about Darwin, let's deal with Darwin for a moment. And, I'm just talking purely biology. I'm not talking about sociological issues. I'm not talking about, what people consider moral or anything like that. But essentially, a woman's window of opportunity is during her mid-teens to her mid-30s. That's the time period where she can have really, she has the best chance of having healthy children with least amount of complications for both herself and the babies. And the thing is, that means there's like 20 years. 20 years that women can biologically have children. Of course, with modern society and social mores and stuff like that, usually nowadays we see the marriage age going up and up and up. I think women now, it's like around 24, 23, 24 is the average age of a first marriage. Just a few years ago, it was like 22. And the thing is that means that you're talking about that window of opportunity being even less. If a person's considering that they're going to get married at 25 and 35, 25 to 35 is the best time to have children, then that's a very small segment of their lives that they can actually do this. Whereas men, now if we look at, how Adler saw things, life goals, he said that our recognition of our mortality and our physical attributes was what separated us from the animals. And Adler noted that our life goals will shape us. And this is why you hear terms like a woman's biological clock ticking and stuff like that. You see, a woman wants to settle, a woman's more likely, not all women, but a woman's more likely to want to settle down and have a family than a man is. Again, that's a generality. There's many men that really want to, be married and have children. I remember that I was in that boat for sure. I really, marriage and family, that was, goal number one. Now, the thing is that men, though, they can look at life differently. They don't have a biological clock in that sense. A man, I've known men as old as their 60s who get married to a younger woman and have a family, have children. I know one guy, how old is he? I know a gentleman, his father's like in his late 80s and he's in his early 20s, just to illustrate that. So men have different things going for them. And, if you do have a situation where a lot of guys actually do kind of vacate the market, yes, sure. The women who are like, well, the Bible says you're supposed to be married, and before you have kids and so forth. Well, those women will, if they're not willing to avail themselves to sperm banks and that sort of things, well, they just won't have kids. They'll kind of perish. I've seen that. I've seen that in the Mormon Church. Now, the Mormon Church tends to say They want their people to marry members of their church. And the thing is, there's always a larger supply of younger women than there is younger men that go to church regularly. And so since, they're very much kind of like, no sex before marriage and that sort of thing, then you do have a situation where, while yes, many married Mormon couples have 4 or 5 kids, there's a large segment of LDS women who go into menopause having never been married and having kids. So it all kind of equals out there. I mean, I think ultimately I would actually say probably kind of at replacement, because you get the ones that never have kids and the ones that have larger families, and it all, winds up maybe being 2.5 or 3 or something like that, but certainly not an average of 5 or 6 kids per woman. It just doesn't happen. Of course, I guess if there was polygamy, it would, but there's I don't see any evidence that that's going to happen in the near future. Now, the thing is that, speaking of which, you may have an increased acceptance of assisted fertility for women who are single, because many women will, especially educated ones, are going to reach their mid-30s. They're not going to have a husband, and they are going to start thinking, wow, it's now or never. And I'll be lucky to have 1 kid, hopefully, maybe 2. And they will go and just go to a fertility clinic and be able to start a family that way. And I think that's going to really grow in popularity. I just can't help but believe that. Secondly, you may have an increase in such thing. Well, I think you're going to have an increase, although I don't know if it's going to be really major, but I think you're going to have an increase in alternative lifestyles. And I'm not just talking about the whole gay marriage thing. I'm talking about maybe polygamy, polyamory, and so forth. I've even heard of such concepts as omnigamy. The idea of social networks that are bonded in more ways than one. And this could grow. And again, much of this would be based on the idea that you will have a shortage of available males if you get more and more males winding up like their Japanese counterparts and deciding, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, live life for the present, play my video games, look at porn, and that sort of thing. Zimbardo recently came out and said, a lot of young men are becoming socially isolated because they just disconnect, and then they start getting into, like, again, gaming and porn and stuff, and that becomes a substitute for real relationships. This is not going to be good for demographics in that sense, unless maybe you do have a situation in which more women just go ahead and go in for assisted pregnancy. But then you got to run into the problem that you're going to have more families with single mothers. And I'm not sure that that's going to be really, really encouraging for raising kids who will then desire to go out there and get married and going back to like a, traditional 1950s kind of relationship norm. So what we may be seeing is maybe the whole men going their own way, or MGTOW, or however they want to say it, or the herbivores in Japan, maybe actually helping to facilitate the whole Brave New World concept that Huxley talked about, in which eventually everything's going to be scientifically based with fertility. Nikola Tesla said that by the end of this century, his prediction was that by the end of the 21st century, that reproduction would all be based on eugenics and would be scientifically manufactured, so to speak. So anyway, it's just something to think about there. When we see these kinds of demographic trends and so forth, they're always going to come with eventually a price. And regardless of the price that maybe felt at a personal level, men and, of course, the women that they would have married, it's going to have a societal consequence. And, it may actually, like I said, it may actually be part of the evolution into a new, brave new world scenario. Anyway, well, we're out of time now. So, again, thank you for tuning in to Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. See you next week. Bye now.
Aussie Skateboard.